October 22 is a very significant day in the history of our beginnings.
Hey guys, welcome back to your June bonus episode here at the Adventist History Podcast. And yes, I know what you're thinking. Why didn't we get a May bonus episode? Well, my friend, this is why they're called bonus episodes. I do them when I can. Sometimes I just don't have time, and that was the story in early May. I did get to go up to the Center for Adventist Research to do some, I guess, research is what you do there in early May. So that was nice, but otherwise, the first 2 weeks of May was absolutely crazy. You all know the drill. I mean, come on. You've lived through COVID. Things get busy. Things happen. Anyways, everything is okay, and it's time to take up the second part of my response to Steve Daly's book, Ellen White, A Psychobiography. Now, if you just discovered this podcast and have no idea what is going on here, then go listen to that first reaction to Steve Daly's podcast. It is the April 2021 bonus episode. A listener came up to me after the first response that I recorded and told me he didn't want to listen to that episode because I called it The Daily, and he had had enough with that whole church controversy over the Daily that happened in the early 20th century. So, yeah, I get it. There are some controversies you just read about and you're like, why? Why would you fight over this? Why is this such a big deal, right? Just go outside and enjoy your day. But we're not always so fortunate to have a nice, clean history where everyone gets along and agrees on everything. Anyways, these episodes are not about that Daily controversy. With Steve Daly, I thought I was being a little clever in how I titled it, but it just turns out I'm triggering some people's PTSD about the whole Daily controversy. So I'm sorry about that. Now, after doing the first episode, I walked away feeling like, hey, I said what should be said. The tone of Daly's book is toxic. He clearly has an axe to grind, even though he says he doesn't. He doesn't deliver what he promised, that is a purely professional analysis of Ellen White, which I said in the last episode is very welcome. Instead, this is a takedown book. It's something TMZ should have published. And as the weeks passed after I released that episode, I read Alberto Tim's thorough and dispassionate response to Daly in an article published by the Church's Biblical Research Institute. If you're interested, I can leave a link to that in the show notes. And I honestly thought, I've said enough. There's no need for a second episode about this. I don't want to pile on the guy. I'm sure he's received a ton of personal messages and emails and comments on Facebook critiquing his book, you should when you come out publicly. You should expect those things. But I don't want to pile on. I think this thing on Twitter, this thing that we do where somebody says something and then 6 million people need to just jump on that person. It's like, hey, he doesn't need my voice along with everybody else's. I've said what I needed to say. It's been handled. Both sides have made their point, and short of inviting Steve on here for a conversation, I'm not sure each side firing off these one-sided arguments is going to enlighten many people. So, whatever topic Daly raises, my critique remains the same. His tone is too mocking. It's cruel. He's very selective in his facts to the point that it borders on dishonesty. And I don't want to do a second episode where I just give you more examples of that, because sometimes I feel like going after the quote unquote heretics is just makes us feel good. It makes us feel confident, and I'm not in it for any of those things. Okay. I don't derive any sort of joy that I'm right and he's wrong or anything like that. This is a lament. This is a lament that the book wasn't what it should have been. Okay. I'm sad. I feel like it was wasted. And now a future psychologist or psychiatrist or whoever who's going to try to go analyze Ellen White and honestly wants to be as fair as possible and as professional as possible. Now they've got this precedent, this thing in their way that Steve Daly did, and it's going to leave a bad taste in people's mouth, and maybe people won't go read the real book, the really professional book that will eventually be written because, they remember this. I don't know. So this is just coming from a place of disappointment, not from a place of, you left the church and you're wrong in everything you think and all that kind of stuff. I don't care about that stuff. Anyways, and I just didn't want to repeat myself as well. I didn't want to just do a second episode and be like, let me just give you more examples of what I said the first time. So that raises the question, why am I doing this episode? And why isn't it called The Daily Part 2, which is what I think I announced it would be called on Facebook. I'm doing this episode because I said I would, first and foremost, all right? But also because grappling with Daly's larger points, which is what I aim to do, is a good excuse to talk about issues in Adventist history, like how James and Ellen White gained and spent their money. Now, whether you're an Adventist or not, the question of how James and Ellen White gained and used their money, for example, is an interesting historical question. And that's the question we're going to tackle in this episode right now. So even though this is a second response to Steve Daly, even though we're going to quote him and all of that, this is becoming less and less really about Steve Daly and his book and more about taking an opportunity to answer some Adventist history questions. And so that's why this episode is called Ellen White's Money and not The Daily Part 2. So we're still going to refer to Steve Daly. We're still going to use him as kind of our launching point in terms of, what are some of the big issues out there that we should be talking about. But it's really about this topic of money and Ellen White and James White in general. There's also another reason for the episode, and that is because Steve Daly is right about something. In his book, and especially on Facebook, Daly's refrain is that Adventists don't really know much about Ellen White, and he's right about that. There are academic books and papers and articles that are really just fascinating that Adventists have published, others have published. In particular, I'm thinking of Ron Graybill's recent Visions and Revisions book, which advertises itself as a textual history of Ellen G. White's writings, which is really a start at that. It's really just kind of the first step. But it's an exciting first step. And among other things, Graybill talks about how Ellen's literary assistants gave final shape to her words, and it is through these words that we come to understand Ellen White. And we point to these published writings, and we say, look at this woman. A woman with a third-grade education wrote all of this. And if you've been an Adventist for long enough, you've probably heard a church leader or pastor say something like that. I know I have. I know I've said it to people. Like, how could somebody with a third-grade education write these masterful sentences, these poetic expressions, these beautiful long books? I've said that too. But as Graybill points out, when you look at Ellen White's first handwritten drafts, she misspelled a ton of words. She would cross things out, add words in the margin as she struggled to find the right way to write things. Just like the rest of us, she would even change the words in between drafts, leading some to wonder if someone else was changing Ellen's words. Isn't every word she ever wrote inspired? How could she change her words from draft to draft? We can treat the final polished form of her writings as if this is Ellen White, and that's what we do. And it very much is Ellen White, just it's not all of Ellen White. It's the produced version of Ellen White. It's the revised and revised and revised version of Ellen White. It's only when you see these handwritten manuscripts that you can get to know the woman with the third-grade education. It's easy to believe every word she ever wrote was inspired when all you read are the polished words, which are in some cases always being refined. I mean, Ellen White's basic material in The Great Controversy was a work that took decades of her life to refine into the volume that Adventists read today. It took a long time. It's a little like seeing someone on a magazine cover. And no doubt they are all naturally beautiful people, but they also had help. There was some good lighting, a good camera, maybe a little bit of photoshopping. And when we read Ellen White's published writings today, they're still her thoughts and they're her words, but they have the benefit of some nice lighting and maybe a little photoshopping, right? Just people saying, hey, Ellen, you could tighten up this sentence here a little bit, that kind of stuff. Most Adventists don't read her letters where she is fighting with her husband or her kids. Perhaps because Adventists don't want to know Ellen, the human woman. They want to hang on to whatever idealistic picture of the great prophet Ellen White that they keep in their wallet as they go. So I have absolutely no problem if someone wants to tell us more about these Adventist pioneers. I want to know who Ellen White and James White and Joseph Bates and F.M. Wilcox. I want to know who all of these people are, not the view of them that we have from the stage. Not the view of them we have from the final draft of whatever it is that they wrote. I want to know who they are. because I think we all recognize that there's a certain lack of, what's the word for it? There's a certain lack of authenticity, I guess, for lack of a better word. You know, you see some of these celebrities on Twitter, or you see them in pictures or whatever, and you know, maybe they say and do things that you're like, I can relate to that person. That person gets me. But of course they don't, right? They don't know you, and you don't really know them, because all you're seeing is the performance. And I don't mean performance as a bad thing. But we're all kind of positioning ourselves. We're all kind of saying things and refining ourselves and adjusting ourselves as we go through life to be more of the person we feel like we're called to be. And Ellen White was the same way. So, you know, it's easy to like somebody from a distance. It's easy to think somebody's, I don't know, good looking from a distance. It's easy to think that I agree with somebody from a distance. And that's all we got with Ellen White, is a distance. You know, but if you can peek into her personal letters or into her first drafts, you can kind of get a better idea of who she is. So I have no problem with anybody who says we need to know more about Ellen White. I think that it is true that Adventists have contented themselves with kind of that view of her from a distance. The myth of Ellen White, and I think George Knight has talked about that a lot lately. Yeah, we have, absolutely. And Daly's not wrong to be like, you guys need to know Ellen White, the good and the bad. You need to figure out what her weaknesses are and the times she struggled and the things she said that she regretted. Sure, you don't know a person until you know those things. Sure. The problem is that with Daly is that I can't trust him to tell the truth about Ellen White. That's really what it comes down to. All right, so let's talk about Ellen White's money. Daly makes the claim that Ellen White received over $3 million in today's value in royalties alone over her lifetime. That James and Ellen also sold a hymnal which raked in $1 million, again in today's money. That she owned a lot of property and would be considered in the top 1% of earners in her day. Okay, those are some claims you find in this book. And I'm not going to argue with any of them because I'm not going to go add up Ellen White's bank accounts over her entire life, okay? So let's just assume all of that is true. We'll give them the benefit of the doubt. But I think the claim sounds more impressive than it really is because, you know, for instance, even today, if you make $50,000 US a year for 30 years, which is, you know, about middle of the middle class in America right now. But if you make that today for 30 years, you've made $1.5 million in your working lifetime. So saying Ellen White made, you know, $3 million in royalties alone over her lifetime, I mean, that's impressive. Don't get me wrong, but, you know, anybody at a middle class job working for 30 years is going to make about half of that. And Ellen White, of course, worked a lot longer than 30 years. So anyways, it sounds really amazing. Like, wow, $3 million. But it's amazing in part because we often don't realize how much we just make over the course of a career. We all make a good a good amount of money here. But okay, fine. She made a lot of money compared to most people in her lifetime. I don't know exactly how much. So we're just going to assume that the numbers we get from Steve Daly are true. Daly, of course, got a lot of this material from Dirk Anderson, who was a former Adventist whose claims about Ellen White and money had been around for a while. And, of course, Dirk Anderson, I think, was at least inspired by D.M. Canwright, who made similar accusations about Ellen White. Let's just say accusations about James and Ellen and their use of money are almost as old as Adventism itself. Okay. What really matters to me is how she made it. Did she extort it from church members? Did she bully church members into buying her books as a get-rich-quick scheme? Daly quotes Ellen White for as encouraging other people to sell their homes in the time of trouble and donate it to the cause. Did Ellen and James White take advantage of church members in order to get rich? This is what Daly says, quote, "This pattern of taking advantage of church members for their own financial gain started as early as 1849 when Ellen was getting visions that the Lord's coming was at hand," end quote. So to me, this is the real accusation here. I mean, maybe you see things differently. I don't care if Ellen White had money. The woman wrote a ton of books. She wrote a ton of books. Obviously, she was not just any old author in the Adventist Church. I imagine Uriah Smith sold a lot of books too. Both books were heavily marketed, I should say both books. Uriah Smith's book and all of Ellen White's books, some more than others, were heavily advertised, right? Members were encouraged to buy them. They were taken by literature evangelists and sold door to door to non-Adventists. It's not surprising to me. It's not scandalous to me that she made a lot of money. The issue here is how she made it, right? So Daly, in that quote about taking advantage of church members as early as 1849, he's alluding to a vision Ellen White had in 1849 where she wrote, quote, "I saw it was the will of God that the saints should cut loose from every encumbrance, dispose of their houses and lands before the time of trouble, and make a covenant with God by sacrifice. I saw they should sell if they laid their property on the altar and earnestly inquired for duty," end quote. Now, Daly interprets this passage to mean that members should sell their properties. I'm actually going to quote him here, so I want to make sure I get this right. Okay, so Daly says that members should, quote, "sell their properties and even give up all their possessions so that the Whites could use such funds for the cause." He puts that in quotes, end quote. All right, let's talk about that quote, and especially the context which is missing. First, Ellen makes it clear in this letter that the theological basis for this advice is the following: that trying to materially prepare for the end times would do you no good. Having enough money or food stashed away somewhere would not help you. To get through the end times, you can only rely upon God, so at some point you won't need your house. Okay, that's her point. That's her point. She didn't say everybody needed to sell their house right now. She said at some point, you're just going to want to get rid of it. All right. Second, Ellen then tells the believers that it is between them and God when and if they sell their house. If this seems strange to you, keep in mind that these people expected Jesus to come any day now. They believed that they had a message of vital importance to the world, and there were only at this time a couple of thousand believers. And also keep in mind that many were farmers, and peeling off a few acres wasn't like they were going to sell their property and go live out in the street, okay? And most importantly, even if they did sell their property, why assume it would go to James and Ellen White in 1849? These are all assumptions that are being made here. But the fact is, we don't have any evidence that a bunch of church members sold their properties, especially their houses, and then were just homeless, and then just moved in with each other. I mean, so I think this statement of Ellen White, and especially the way that Daly interprets it, it seems more radical than it really is. I mean, of course, we read in the book of Acts that plenty of early Christians sold property and donated it to the cause. I'm sure back then there were some people who were thinking that maybe Peter, why is all this money going to the apostles? What's Peter doing with it? Is he going to buy another sword to replace the one that he had? Okay, anyways, you know what I'm saying? But Luke doesn't write down those kind of accusations or murmurings if they did exist in the New Testament. Obviously, with James and Ellen White, more stuff gets written down in the 1800s. That's just how it works. And I'm not saying that James and Ellen are Peter and Paul, okay? I'm just saying that this idea of believers selling their houses and donating it to the cause did not originate with Ellen White, okay? We do know that a number of members did sell their property and donate it to the cause, but if James and Ellen were hoping to get rich off members selling their houses, then they were sorely disappointed because there was no organization at this point. Some members sold their property and they gave it to the first Adventist preacher who showed up at their home. So, because where else are you going to send it? Where else are you going to send it? You probably live days away from, the headquarters in New York or wherever. And, there was no clear, you could give it to Joseph Bates, you could give it to any other preacher. And so this did happen. This did happen. And imagine being one of these preachers. Again, there's no system for paying these preachers. It was usually an offering was taken up when they showed up. Oftentimes they got very little compensation, which is why systematic benevolence was adopted by the church in the 1850s as a way of paying for the preachers so they could, make enough money in order to keep preaching. But every once in a while, I guess, maybe somebody in that congregation sold their property and they're like, here's $200,000, That's crazy, right? Can you imagine being that pastor that Sabbath? Man alive, you think you preached the best sermon you've ever preached in your life. Again, there's no church organization. So just because people are selling their homes, there's no reason to think they sent it all to James and Ellen. All right, this is what happens when you read back into history and you think, well, they were leaders. They were the two main leaders later. Why weren't they the two main leaders? At every juncture in Adventist history. Well, Joseph Bates was a leader in the first years, the primary guy. Maybe they gave a lot of it to him. I don't know. Ellen White complained about this habit of dumping a ton of money on preachers every once in a while, arguing that, hey, here's my husband taking on debts in publishing the review while some of these preachers are being given enormous sums of money. It wasn't an efficient system. Sometimes it wasn't a fair system. And I suppose if you're a cynic, you might argue that Ellen White secretly wanted all the money for herself, but there's no reason to suspect that from her letters. I mean, every indication is that things were exactly as they appeared. James was indeed deep in debt on account of the publishing work, and that made him and Ellen desperate for every cent, and they were constantly asking people for money, to be faithful, to donate money. There's no evidence that she spent it to live in luxury during these years or squirreled it away in some secret vault that they had during these years. He very much was in debt, and I don't think you would do that if your goal is to get rich quick. That'd be the dumbest get-rich-quick plan I've ever seen. More irony is still to come. I just want to mention because I was reading through some of Ellen White's writings about her royalties and all that stuff on one of the White Estates websites. I was realizing how far I think Daly missed the mark about Ellen White's greed. I mean, I think he's really interpreting this as negatively as possible. But then as I was reading, an ad popped up on the White Estate website where they were asking me to donate. And I mean, just gosh. I mean, not now, guys. Not now. Anyways, let's talk about James White. By today's standards, and perhaps even by the standards of his day, I think James was constantly putting himself on shaky ground when it came to matters of money. He was the off and on president of the church, whether officially or not, while he was also borrowing from and loaning to his church members. Now, even if he never cheated anyone, it is considered unethical today to occupy that kind of position. James dealt with vast sums of money. In one letter, he directed his son Willie to sell a property in Oakland for $7,200 to one church member, then to pay hundreds of dollars in interest on another loan he received from another church member, and then he announced his intention to loan another $5,000 to the church. And as Daly rightly notes, these are huge sums of money for people to be messing around with, even without adjusting for inflation. I mean, how many people have $7,200 or $5,000 that they can just move around like that? All right. Again, not even adjusting for inflation. Daly also, anyways, there's a difference between something being immoral and unethical, and I want to make sure that that's clear. And I think James's position was definitely unethical. No church leader would be permitted to operate that way today, okay? You can give James an allowance if you want. You can give him a pass saying, look at the times he lived in. What else was he going to do? We didn't have the organization back then that we have today, blah, 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 blah. But just on a personal level, you don't want to be loaning, if you're a church leader, you don't want to be loaning money to church members or accepting money from church members. It's just an ethical concern, all right? It puts you in a really bad spot. It makes abuse or extortion very tempting sometimes. And so it's just not something you want to do. Now, Daly points out that James once spent $500 on a single photographic negative. Now, the historicity of that does not seem as clear to me as Dirk Anderson and Steve Daly think, because the background of it is the Whites apparently had their picture taken in 1876 in Oakland. There were some photographs taken by Lathrop and Durham, who were famous photographers in California during those years, and some other photographs taken by someone named Ingleson. Now, Lathrop apparently was very pleased with his photographs and put a photo of James up in his storefront window, which again was a very famous studio in San Francisco. He then told Ellen that he would sell the negative of James to him for $500. Now, with that negative, of course, James and Ellen wouldn't have to keep buying prints from Lathrop every time they were in town. I don't think the letter is crystal clear that James or Ellen actually paid the $500 for it. Ellen is just informing James of what Lathrop had said. Hey, if you want it, it's $500. Now, maybe there's a response from James saying, oh, yes, please get it, or I got it, that I didn't see that they found. But, I didn't dive into this that deeply because, even if James did buy it, a case could be made for doing so, I think. I mean, in another letter, James talked about sending prints of his picture to Europe in case the new converts over there wanted to know what the church's leader looked like. And, of course, these photographs could be used in the books that James was writing or Ellen was writing. James was a public man, and even today, spending a few $100s on headshots is part of the professional game for some career paths. I mean, it's just something you have to do. If you want to be a model or, in certain aspects of business, you need to go get professional headshots. They cost a ton of money. It's just part of it. But even if there was no good reason to buy the negative, the guy spent the equivalent of a few grand on something, okay? Personally, I once bought a suit of Roman armor, sword and all, when I was in college making $7 an hour. Was it a waste of money? Totally. But come on, we all do something like that. Also, if anyone wants to buy a set of Roman armor, I can cut you a deal. Just send me a message. The truth is that it is very difficult to analyze the Whites' finances. I wish someone would make a detailed study of it, but that would be a painstaking task. We do know that James earned a lot of money. We do know that James's entrepreneurialism was intertwined with his role as a leader in the church. We know that he also spent a lot of money. The issue is whether he made this money dishonestly or or unethically, I guess I should say. Did he strong-arm people under his authority or influence? I don't think there's a reason to think that he made his money dishonestly, and as it relates to cheating church members, I just don't see any evidence of that. Oh, but Daly shares these statements where James complains that Adventists aren't buying enough of the charts or books or whatever that he and his wife were writing. Daly shares another statement where James says that there is wealth in our pens. He's getting that from Dirk Anderson. There's yet wealth in our pens, James tells his wife. We can make money through writing, presumably is what he meant. Okay, fine. Daly has a number of degrees. Did Daly ever have a class, or maybe you, listener, ever have a class where the professor requires the students to buy a textbook that the professor wrote? We probably all have at some point. And most of us have probably smirked at this slick money-making scheme that the professor has going on. And, that's the cynical way of looking at it. From the perspective of the professor, perhaps no other book shares the specific ideas that he or she wants to teach. Maybe he is writing this to climb the ladder, right, to get his name out there. Or maybe the professor is one of the leading experts in the field and no one else could write this textbook. There could be any number of reasons why the professor might want to write a book and require his or her students to buy it. I doubt many professors would go through the enormous work of writing a book in order to force 30 or 40 students per semester or per year to buy it. I mean, and earn what, $50 in royalties? Do you realize how much work it is to write a book? It's just not worth the effort. And what's more, if money was the professor's focus in life, then why on earth is he or she a professor? And that's the same question of James White. Okay, sure, it worked out for him and his wife financially, but the guy was dirt poor, and so was she when they both started preaching. There was no guarantee that things would work out the way that they worked out. And if James's overriding goal in life was to make money, well, then he chose the wrong career. Now, the truth is probably messier. I don't think anyone can seriously doubt that James and Ellen believed their books would honestly help people. There's plenty of evidence of that, even today, that it does help people. James and Ellen really believed that Ellen had words from God for the people. Okay, you can disagree whether or not that's true, but it's clear enough that she believed that. Even Daly admits that. So if they believe that, why would they not encourage the people to buy her books? If you really thought God had given you a message to tell people, would you not promote that? Would you just sit on it? Because I think that would be wrong. Now, I say the truth is messier because no doubt James ran the numbers on how this would help them financially. If you lived in the 1800s, you worried about money. Read Jane Austen. Just because James was aware of the money issue doesn't mean that this was his or Ellen's major motive. Okay, you can want to help people and want to make money and survive as a family at the same time. I want to study and teach Adventist history. I love doing this podcast. But yeah, it's also nice to have patrons who support me in doing this, okay? That doesn't mean I'm doing this podcast in order to make money, because that would be an exceptionally bad idea. It's not worth it. I'm making a little bit of money in order to do this podcast, in order to fund research, in order to do these other things, and also so I can look my wife in the eye when she's like, "Are you going to record again? Oh, it takes so long." And I can say, "Hey, at least we have some awesome patrons." And then she says, "Okay." Anyways, Daly talks about how James spent all of this money on a photograph, but ignores how much of James's money was all wrapped up in the church. On one occasion, James wrote his son Willie that, quote, "Though I own a good share of both San Francisco and Oakland churches, I do not expect to speak in them," end quote. James was human. He complained that the Adventists in California were sending so much money for missionary work in Europe, while he, has paid for their church buildings. This is an important point to keep in mind. James, his family, and his church were all hopelessly tangled together. Sometimes this caused family quarrels. The context is not clear, but it seems at some point James told Willie that his advice had always been taken so long as he had money, implying that Willie didn't listen to Dad when he was broke. Okay. Now, Willie, that's like what every dad has said. Willie seems to have taken offense at this and perhaps said things that hurt his father deeply, and James was always, he was always worried about money. Maybe he valued it too much, but that's just the way he was wired. If you have a family member like that, or maybe you're like that, there's just people who have that entrepreneurial mindset and they can't turn it off. Like they're always looking for I could buy this in this town and take it over there and make money. It's not necessarily greed. I just think it's the game. They like the game. And it's not always about the money. It's about the earning money part. That's the part that really draws them. So James earned a lot. He spent a lot. And this entanglement of his personal finances with the churches is, as I said, a huge red flag. Huge red flag. But there's just no evidence it's anything more than a red flag. What we do know is that James's business sense benefited both him and it benefited the church greatly. Now, after James died, Ellen White poured herself into writing her books. In the 1890s, she clashed with Adventist publishing houses who cut their royalty payments to their authors. Here she was, stranded in Australia with a large household to maintain. Willie White's wages were cut too, and Ellen was livid. The church she helped found, the church she helped create, just slashed her paycheck, essentially, and that of her sons. Ellen began to suspect that those at the top in America were just royally screwing things up, and I know we've never thought that since then. And so Ellen fired off angry letter after angry letter to leaders in the publishing work or to the poor General Conference president. You can read about it in Gilbert Ballantyne's The Prophet and the Presidents. He covers that decade pretty thoroughly and Ellen White's relationship to those leaders. During this time, she was also sued by her nephew-in-law because her nieces had come to visit, and it seems that they bonded with Auntie Ellen, and when they returned home, their dad sued her for alienation of affections, like that, charging Ellen that she was trying to kind of get in between them and their dad. Ellen had to settle that out of court. We don't know how much she paid. Probably wasn't a few dollars. And also, we had well-meaning Adventists who showed up at Ellen White's house so often that she ended up pitching a tent on her property where she could entertain visitors. And of course, they expected that she would feed them. That costs money. Ellen also had a large staff. People D.M. Canwright snarkily calls her servants, which also cost a lot of money. This staff was involved in doing research in response to questions people would ask in their letters to Ellen White. One might serve as a proofreader or editor, while another was a typist. In the case of Willie White, he basically served as his mother's business manager. He would draw up the contracts with the publishers, working out the figures of how many copies they would need to sell of a certain book at different royalty rates, and just kind of negotiate with them which rate would work best for which book, where the proceeds should go, because in many of her books, she donated all the royalties to, something, whatever, education, whatever it may be. She would also end up paying for translation sometimes, or for the printing plates, those plates that are used to very, very, very expensive, that basically are the, how do you phrase it today? It's basically the book. It's the set type of the book. And then copies would be made, ink would be put on it, and copies would be made over and over and over again. It's how the book was printed. And when those things wore out, you needed new printing plates. That sort of thing. And of course, when you have a staff like this, you need someone to cook for this crew and probably someone to clean, because the whole point is to let Ellen White write and not clean, picking up after everyone all day. And above all, she needed a house where these people could work and a secure vault at this house or somewhere nearby for all of her writings, and hence the estate in California that we call Elmshaven. Now, Arthur White, Ellen's grandson, in giving the readers of the ministry a virtual tour of the place, he called it, quote, a modest estate consisting of a few acres of farm and hill land, end quote. All right, Arthur, that's a stretch. A few acres of farm and hill land? Buddy, Elmshaven was 74 acres when Ellen White bought it, okay? It's a few acres. And it did. It certainly cost more than probably most any other Adventist was able to afford for a home. Canwright is fixated on the place's value, $20,000, he says, which, probably wasn't far from the truth. The Elmshaven property was part of a large purchase by two brothers back in 1871. One of the brothers became an Adventist a couple of years later, helping to build the Rural Health Retreat, which is now Adventist Health's St. Helena Hospital. The health retreat went through several name changes, so we're just going to call it St. Helena Hospital for this episode. Anyways, the non-Adventist brother eventually sold his half, which included the Elmshaven home, and in 1900, which was purchased by the manager of the St. Helena Hospital, who needed some more land for the hospital. He wanted to build a health food factory and some other stuff. That manager paid $8,000 for this tract of land, but had no idea what to do with the house that was on it. He didn't want it. So it worked out, because a few months later, after he purchased his property, a homeless Ellen White showed up on the shore, fresh off the boat from Australia. And she was going to pay $8,000 for this property, but as part of the deal, she agreed to transfer some portions of the property to the hospital. And so she ended up paying $5,000 for her share of it, with $1,000 down in cash. And so she got a mortgage for the other $4,000 at a 6.25% interest rate. Now I ask, since everybody likes to make a big deal about Elmshaven and how much it costs and how much it was valued and all that, did Ellen White rip anyone off here? Did they give her some magical church profit discount? I mean, it doesn't seem so. The property may have been worth $20,000 by the time she died, but she didn't pay anywhere near that much money. It seems she just moved to California at just the right time. And frankly, I wish my house value would go up 400% as well. Daly says that the $5,000 asking price was an under market price, because he said that those 74 acres today would be worth something like $10 million. Now, this is deceptive, and it's just typical Daly. It's deceptive because the only reason why Ellen White paid $5,000 is that she agreed to sell off nearly 10 of those acres, including her half of the right to a natural spring which watered her land. Okay, that's a critical piece of real estate there. You want to have your control, at least half of the control of your water source. And she gave that up. And she gave up a bunch of other acres as well, and that's what brought her price down to $5,000. She would have paid $8,000 if she wanted all 74 acres, which is what the manager of the hospital had paid for it. Okay, so he paid for it in the spring, let's say, put $8,000 down. If Ellen White wanted to keep all 74 acres, she would have showed up later that year and paid $8,000, exactly what he paid for it. So when Daly calls it an under market price, she paid for it what the guy who bought it before her paid for it. So then the manager must have got it at an under market price. Good for him. It's not, the implication from Daly is that somebody, gave her a steep discount, but there's just that, no, that's not what happened at all. Anyways, he's trying to pull a fast one on us. He's giving us a discounted price, saying Ellen White paid $5,000 for 74 acres, but he's ignoring that she sold off the land in order to get it for $5,000. But that's typical with him. I mean, it's like saying, Lau, look at this preacher in Peoria here. He's really extravagant. Some church member sold him a Maserati for $10,000. Okay, but it didn't have an engine in it. Don't conveniently leave off that fact. Okay. Maserati is probably still worth more than $10,000 even without an engine. But anyways, that's the kind of thing that Daly is doing here. He also calls this 8-room house a mansion. I mean, it is a big house, but I think if anybody's ever been to Biltmore or Versailles, no one's going to call Elm's Haven a mansion. So whatever. Anyways, there's no doubt that the living institution that was Ellen White cost a lot of money, whether from the expense of her home, her help, or the lawsuits and loans that she had to deal with. But of course, there's more to it than this. Steve Daly and D.M. Canright are both correct that Ellen wasn't a good business manager. Her husband always had the investment off to the side to provide for the family if needed. Ellen wasn't good about such things. I mean, if she had $100 in her pocket and you showed up asking for money to help build a church somewhere, I get the impression that chances are she'd give it to you. She presided over a high cash flow operation. A lot came in and a lot went out, and she doesn't show a detailed grasp of how it was all working like her husband would have. James knew. He was shrewd. He knew what was coming in. He knew what was owed to him. He knew where his money was that he had loaned out and how long each person had to repay him. He had an eye for these things. Ellen doesn't seem to have had that eye. She just trusted. She just trusted that money would appear as she needed it and that she would just continue to be generous with it when she got it. And when it didn't, at some times in her life, like in the early 1890s, when the money didn't come in, she got cranky and she wrote letters to the General Conference. She was upset, right? In one case, I think she had given the church $20,000 and they hadn't repaid it by the end of 1894, and she was frustrated by this. So yeah, there's no doubt that this added to her stress when things got tight in the 1890s. There's no doubt that James and Ellen earned a lot of money in their lifetime. There's no doubt that James and Ellen spent a lot of money in their lifetime. And if you want to quibble, you can harp on them for things you feel they could have done without. Fine. There's no doubt that subsequent church leaders and fans of Ellen White downplayed some of this, as Arthur White did when describing their property as modest. Frankly, arguing about whether Elmshaven was too big or too expensive for Ellen White just feels miserly. It just feels like small-spirited. I mean, really, honestly. Okay? It's not the White House. It was a lot of land, but what exactly did that do for a 72-year-old woman? When you go inside the house or you see pictures of inside the house, it's not exactly palatial. The staircase feels cramped by any standard today. There were always people around her and in the house, so that she probably only had 1 or 2 rooms she could consider private. She bought it fair and square, and above all, she earned that home. All right, she worked hard her entire life, so give her a break. Canright's chapter on Ellen White's money is titled, Used Her Gift to Get Money. I'm sorry. Doesn't everyone use their gifts to get money? I mean, if I have the gift of evangelism or leadership, wouldn't I naturally use those gifts to make a living? Would Canright rather that I use those gifts to become a janitor? Didn't Canright use his gifts of, whatever, writing or speaking to make a living also? I mean, my gosh, man, we tend to use the gifts that God has given us to make a living. What's the problem here? She used her gift to get money? Duh! That's what we all do. What's at stake here is whether or not Ellen White ripped people off or used her spiritual authority to take advantage of, pliable church members. And when you read Daly or even Canright's charges from this perspective, I can't really find much. Daly spends a few pages talking about the Whites' property and how they owned a house in this town and that town and how much those houses cost throughout their lives. He mentions that she wore rich clothes, how she visited resorts all the time, health resorts. But he doesn't really allege that she ripped people off. He claims that in the 1860s, Ellen White went around selling dress patterns to church members for $1 a piece, which he says is something like $25 today. Okay, so what? What's the problem here? Have you never had a speaker come to your church and they want to set up a table to sell books and DVDs after Sabbath? I mean, that's a thing that happens in Adventism. Maybe not as much now as it used to, but that was always a thing. What's the problem here? She's selling dress patterns for $1? And this is what exactly? Is she making people buy this? In the end, I do have some questions about how Ellen White spent her money. I would love to know more about it. I can understand why ethical concerns might be raised, particularly with how James White functioned as General Conference president and as a businessman on the side. We would rightly be wary of such arrangements today, because plenty of people have given in to the temptation to use their authority to make themselves richer or to use their riches to get more authority. But there's just no smoking gun here. There's just nothing really that damning in all of these allegations about their finances. I mean, you read the whole chapter in Daly's book and you're like, that's it? That's all you got? I would love to know what she did with all the money she earned from Steps to Christ, which would have been in the tens of thousands of dollars, if not the hundreds of thousands of dollars. And since she died deeply in debt, I really want to know where all of that money went. She was worth about $65,000 on paper in the end, and that included her book plates, her royalties due to her, all that kind of stuff. But she owed $100,000. To whom? For what? We may never have a full picture of that, but is this the same thing as saying that she preyed on church members to personally enrich herself? No. Steve Daly isn't even close to proving anything of the sort. So, we've gone on long enough, I think. I hope this episode was helpful. Maybe we will revisit it sometime by doing a deep dive into how the whole book writing and royalties thing worked. If you want an episode like that, just let me know and we can put it in the hopper. I enjoy this stuff. I wish I knew a bored CPA who would be willing to painstakingly go through her letters over the decades, add up the numbers, and try to do some contextual research to fill in the gaps. We will probably, however, never know the whole story because detailed financial records just don't really exist for her as a person. But maybe someone can find a year or more where we can paint a detailed picture and then hopefully extrapolate from that for the rest of her life. So if you're a bored CPA, send me an email. I mean, what else you got going on if you're bored? As for the rest of you, I hope you have an absolutely fantastic day. Thanks for listening to the Adventist History Podcast.